The editor of United Airlines In-Flight magazine in Chicago, and I received a phone call from the public relations staff at Goodyear. They're located in Akron, Ohio, as you probably know. They wanted to persuade me to write an article in United's magazine about the Goodyear blimp. You know, the one you often see at football games on TV. And my quick answer was, well, yes, if you give me a ride in your blimp. And they said, yeah, we can do that. And so I would have to fly out to LA, where they keep one of, Goodyear has 3 blimps. And one of them is in LA, one in Akron, and one in New York, I guess. So I flew to LA and I met with the Goodyear people at the airport where the blimp was based. I walked to the small control car at the bottom of that big, huge bag filled with helium. You know, you got that big gas bag and there's a little tiny control booth that runs it. Well, there were only a few seats in that control car, I think maybe 6 or 8. And you couldn't see, it felt like being in a small plane or helicopter, because you couldn't see that great big balloon up overhead. It blocked out the sky entirely. That was a surprise to me. I didn't, but it was a very silent, floating experience, and it was a slow, peaceful view of everything below us, providing a wonderful view of the Los Angeles area. Well, the Goodyear people, they welcomed guests by turning on panels of bright lights all the way across this giant gas bag. And it said, Goodyear welcomes Norm Richards. It said in big block letters. Looking out the window, I thought, there must be 3 million people down there wondering who in hell Norm Richards is. I followed up this experience by writing an article about the Goodyear blimps, which appeared in the next United Airlines magazine. Well, that led to an offer from a book publisher to write a book about all the great airships of the past, and that was quite a history. You know, you see those. Sometimes I think the Smithsonian shows these old movie films taken when the early days of aviation, when they would strap big wings on and try to fly. They tried everything and cracked up. But there's kind of a colorful history behind it. Well, I was lucky because it took me more than a year to research and write this book. It was a big first-class job. And the New York Times gave that book a good review. And that counts a lot for a book author. Most books aren't even chosen to be reviewed by the New York Times. So if you are lucky enough to have one reviewed there, it really establishes you as a professional writer. So that led to my writing book after book in the years that followed. You know, it's been all these, actually in all of history, no human had been able to look down at the world from a great height other than mountaintops until 1783. Think of it, all those centuries gone by and nobody ever was able to get off the ground. So in 1785, the first attempt was made to cross the English Channel from England to France by air in a big balloon. An enthusiastic crowd cheered as two men rose skyward. They were Jean-Pierre Blanchard, a French balloonist, and John Jeffries, a wealthy American doctor who agreed to pay all the expenses if he could go along. A year earlier in France, a hot air balloon built in France by the Montgolfier brothers had carried two men for a short distance, but there hadn't been much progress since then. Now these two fearless adventurers were ready to prove it was possible to travel long distances by air and to control the direction of flight. It was impossible to steer balloons when the wind moved them where you didn't want to go. Well, their flight vehicle was considered a marvel of ingenuity at the time. It had a valve at the neck of the balloon so that hydrogen could be added or released with control. They had ballast bags, just big bags filled with sand or water, and they were carried so the balloon could be made to rise, or by throwing overboard, they could help control it. They also carried a barometer, which helped them foresee weather conditions and measure atmospheric pressure. Well, their flight balloon vehicle also had four wings or rudders and a rear fin to stabilize it to control the direction it went. Well, this didn't work at all. They didn't realize that a balloon traveling with the wind cannot be steered unless it is anchored to give it some resistance. While Blanchard and Jeffries were traveling in style, and they were both very proud men and aware of the tremendous publicity that their flight would gain. So they were dressed in fine clothes, and they took with them, I can't believe this, but they took with them scientific almanacs, musical instruments, letters, objects of art, food, and a great big bottle of champagne. They were prepared to be met by a large crowd in France after a triumphant landing. So this team, they began their flight in a light mood after hearing the cheers of the crowd of well-wishers below. But their balloon had no sooner risen into the cold sky when their mood quickly changed, because one look at the barometer told them that a low pressure area was approaching. Well, that meant a change in wind direction. They tried to use the rudders, which didn't work, of course. They were prisoners of the wind. So then a more immediate problem occurred. The balloon was rapidly sinking toward the cold gray water of the English Channel. So they threw a bag of sand overboard, and the balloon rose a little, enough so they could continue in the general direction of France. But about a third of the way across the channel, they began to sink again. After throwing all their ballast overboard, they noticed they still weren't rising enough. They argued about which items should throw out next, and there wasn't much left. So they finally decided we'll throw out half of our scientific books. So several hours later, that managed to keep them going. Several hours later, the coast of France came into view. Both men shouted excitedly and loudly, and they waved as Jeffries climbed into the rigging until Blanchard remarked, "Stop making a fool of yourself. We're still sinking. We've got to throw everything out." Well, now they were desperate. They threw out their food, their books, and their scientific instruments. Jeffries said a tearful goodbye to his large bottle of champagne. There was nothing left to throw out but clothing. Blanchard stripped off all his clothing, threw it out, and stood shivering in the wind, waiting for Jeffries to follow suit. But Jeffries refused, and they argued. He said he had no intention of facing the French people with no clothes on. Just then the balloons rose, and the balloon rose. And an hour later they did make it. They landed on the coast. One of them stark naked and one clothed. It was not a very distinguished arrival. Only a small crowd met them when they limped forward, waving shyly. But they were not discouraged. They had recognized that balloons cannot be steered with rudders, but they also proved that humans could travel considerable distances by air. In the following years, men tried everything they could think of to steer balloons. The balloons were used more extensively, both for military and commercial purposes. Men tried manually driven propellers, oars, and parasols. And it was even suggested that trained vultures be harnessed to balloons to provide traction. I wonder who tried that one. It became clear that some sort of power was needed to provide resistance to the wind if the aircraft were ever to be steered. Well, it was the steam engine that finally worked in 1852 when a Frenchman named Henri Giffard flew a craft driven by motor for the first time in history. He piloted a long cigar-shaped balloon which had a 3-horsepower steam engine in it. It set a big propeller in motion. The engine was in a bamboo basket, actually, beneath the balloon, and the exhaust was tilted downward to keep cylinders from igniting the hydrogen-filled balloon. Well, Gifford took off from Paris and flew to the city of Trappes, several miles away. The wind proved too strong to fly against, but he succeeded in steering the ship in circles and with his propeller and rudder, and he found that an airship could be steered. Well, his speed was only 6 miles an hour, but he showed other aeronauts that it could be done. In the next 30 or 40 years, more and more flights were conducted using various forms of power. The long cigar shape cut down wind resistance and became the standard shape for dirigibles, as the French called balloons that could be steered. But the first truly successful, dependable dirigible was the La France, built in 1884. It was powered by an electric motor, which was operated by batteries. The airship maneuvered perfectly. Its only weakness was that the batteries wore out too soon, and this prevented long flights. Finally, the perfect power plant, the gasoline engine, was invented in 1888 in Germany. Soon, aeronauts were fitting their airships with these power plants. A young Brazilian named Alberto Santos Dumont became the leading airship designer in France. The son of a wealthy coffee plantation owner, probably wasn't Starbucks. He became the leading airship designer, and he hired workmen and built a gasoline-powered 82-foot dirigible. Now this was getting big. It was non-rigid with no framework, and it held 6,000 cubic feet of gas. He installed a 3.5 horsepower engine, and he went on to build a succession of progressively better dirigibles. Well, in 1900, the French Aero Club offered a prize of $16,000 to the first person to take off from the Aero Club Park, fly to the Eiffel Tower, go around the tower, and fly back to the starting point within 30 minutes. Note, this was even before the Wright brothers got off the ground with their craft. Santos Dumont, who was a dashing and impetuous young man, told all his friends that he would win the prize easily. Having made this boast, he was determined not to fail. In his attempt, some of the dirigible's suspension ropes got caught in the propeller, and he had to shut off the engine. Then, of course, the dirigible drifted like a free balloon, and it collided with the roof of a tall hotel and was wrecked. The long girder supporting the car in which he rode came to rest with one end on one building and the other end on another building. Santos Dumont was trapped in an awkward position, hanging between the buildings in view of the crowd until firemen rescued him. And after this embarrassing public failure, the young Brazilian, stung by the crowd's laughing and jeering, vowed to capture the prize and save face. He built a bigger dirigible with 16 horsepower engine, and he tried again. Well, he was making good progress when a guide rope caught on a house and yanked the dirigible to a stop. People climbed up on the house and unhitched the rope for him, and the flight continued at an altitude of 800 feet. Santos Dumont circled the tower carefully, and he started back. The engine began to misfire, the airship started to drift a little, but then the engine picked up again, and he flew back to the starting point, having lost some precious time, but still making good time. He was moving fast. With 45 seconds left, the dirigible crossed the finish mark, but it was too high for anyone to grab the mooring line. So after another minute and a half, it was caught and tied. Well, Santos Dumont emerged, waving his hat jauntily at the crowd. But then he was smiling. His smile turned to a sour look a minute later, though. An official of the Aero Club informed the crowd that he had not won the prize because the rope had not been grabbed until after the 30-minute time had expired. So the Aero Club took a lot of heat for that. A lot of people said that wasn't fair to him. And 2 weeks later, the Aero Club changed their minds and ruled that he had won the prize after all. Well, as Santos Dumont accepted the money and distributed it among his workmen and the poor people of Paris. Then he promptly resigned from the Aero Club as a protest against the unsportsmanlike behavior of some of its members. Santos Dumont went on to become a legend in French aviation. He used his own personal dirigible as a runabout, and he was often seen cruising down the Champs-Élysées at a low altitude, or else he was anchoring the airship by his house while he dropped in for lunch. I wonder who was making lunch. What a startling sight that must have been at a time when it wasn't even common to see airplanes flying. After the gasoline engine made it possible to steer airships, then progress was made on efforts to make dirigibles bigger, faster, and more dependable. One way to do that was to build steel frames inside the gigantic fabric that held the lighter-than-air gas that lifted the airship. And, you know, that would be an example of that gas bag, and holding it so that it didn't, collapse or will. The steel frames really made it better. Builders in Germany, Britain, Italy, and the U.S. were the leaders in creating improved airships. The steel frames gave stability to the aircraft and provided more room inside. It didn't have to have gas take up all the space inside that big bag. They could wall some of it off, and the total dimensions of these newer airships were awe-inspiring. The U.S. Navy's Akron, launched in 1931, was 785 feet long with a diameter of 135 feet. The most remarkable feature of the Akron, now this was a Navy thing, but was its onboard fleet of 5 small airplanes and its trapeze system. The planes could leave the airship even when it was in flight and speed away to find enemy ships miles away. And then they could return to the airship and go back up and be parked inside it. Each of the planes was equipped with a hook mounted on the top wing, and the pilot had to fly up under the giant dirigible and engage the hook with a metal trapeze hanging below the ship. Once the hook was firmly in place, an electric motor pulled the trapeze through an opening in the bottom of the dirigible and lifted it right up where the plane was placed in a hangar inside. Well, the plane could also be launched by the same procedure. The pilot would simply release the hook-on apparatus and fly away. Pilots had to be some precise flying, though, to approach that dirigible at slow speed and hook up accurately. During some practice landings on a trapeze hanging from a dirigible, a young Navy lieutenant named Howard Young had found himself stuck. The plane was stuck, and it had to dangle underneath the blimp. The airship commander knew he couldn't land without crushing this pilot and plane, so the dirigible continued to circle while Young struggled to free the plane from the stuck hook on the trapeze. Finally, it was decided that the only way that plane was going to get off the hook trapeze where it was stuck was for somebody to climb down and knock it off. Another young Navy lieutenant, George Kellerman, volunteered for this hazardous, God, it was a hazardous job. He slipped a wrench into his pocket, lowered himself down on the trapeze, and spent 10 perilous, windswept minutes pounding the hook until the plane was released. You know, tragically, a number of the big American dirigibles crashed during the 20s and 30s with loss of lives. The Navy had built most of them. The leading causes of these crashes were thunderstorms. There was just too much surface area in these giant airships, and it was too easy for them they were vulnerable to updrafts, downdrafts, and other effects of weather. Well, the public eventually feared flying in those dirigibles and gave up on them. But Germany was the leader among the dirigible flying nations, and it had an enormously popular airship called the Graf Zeppelin. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it was the It circled the world. It went all the way around the world and provided comfortable, dependable passenger service for years. That Graf Zeppelin flew usually at 1,000 feet at about 60 to 70 miles an hour with paying passengers in it. The view from this smooth floating craft could not be matched by the tossing, wind-whipped airplanes of those days. It was a lot more comfortable, too. It had 10 staterooms inside the shape of that gas bag, but walled off from the gas. Passengers said it was almost like taking an ocean voyage. By the time it was retired in 1937, the Graf Zeppelin had made 590 flights. It flew more than 1 million miles, including 144 ocean crossings, and it carried 13,000 passengers without a fatality. You know, on performance, the Graf Zeppelin was the greatest dirigible ever. But now it's time to move on to the most famous dirigible of all time, the Hindenburg. But that one is not remembered only for its successes, obviously, but for tragedy. Its spectacular crash in 1937 was filmed for all the world to see. And most of you have probably seen it on TV or in a movie. On a personal note, I spent 4 years in the Navy. I was an air traffic controller, and I've seen fatal air crashes up close. Believe me, that's something I wouldn't recommend to any of you. The movie versions are not as powerful as reality. But the crash of the Hindenburg is still fascinating because there has never been absolute proof of the cause. And that airship was the most glamorous of all the giant dirigibles in the world, which makes it the most interesting. The Hindenburg was 803 feet long. That's 27 feet longer than the Graf Zeppelin. And it was the most powerful and graceful of all dirigibles. There were 25 electrically heated staterooms on the Hindenburg, with 2 beds in each. On a typical transatlantic flight of 2.5 days, it took that long to get across the ocean. 2.5 days. Most of the passengers spent considerable time in the lounge, the reading and writing room, writing letters back home, the dining room, or strolling on the promenades where they could walk and look out through large windows. You know, there was a grand piano in the lounge. And I think they even hired entertainers to play that grand piano. The dining room had fresh flowers and gourmet meals, including turkey, lobster, brook trout, ice cream, and fine German wines, of course. But would you believe this? There was a smoking room on the Hindenburg. Well, you know, you have to think, in those days there wasn't the knowledge of what smoking could do to people or the fires it could cause. But they were careful. Passengers were required to check their matches and lighters before takeoff. And they were not permitted to retain any in their possessions during the trip. To smoke, they had to go to the fireproof smoking room. I think it was lined with tin panels. Here they could smoke and enjoy the view through the windows. In the first week of May 1937, the Hindenburg departed Germany for Lakehurst, New Jersey, with 97 people aboard, including crew members. After crossing the ocean, it circled, bringing gusts and rain showers the airship continued to circle. A big crowd of spectators had gathered at the Naval Air Station where it would land. News reporters, photographers, and radio announcers were standing by to record the most famous dirigible's first arrival of the year. So they valved some hydrogen off and some water ballast was dropped. They had to trim the airship's balance. But a crew member noticed that the ship was a little tail heavy, and it moved smoothly toward a position over the mooring mast. It was about 500 feet up. So then the engine idled and the giant dirigible stopped dead in the air, hovering over the handlers waiting to grab the mooring lines as it descended. Suddenly, the fabric covering near the tail of the ship fluttered. A bright spark of light appeared on top, hovered for a second, then suddenly burst into flame. And a lot of you have seen that, I'm sure, in the films. There was the sound of a muffled explosion, and the whole tail section of the Hindenburg turned into a burning mass as its hydrogen cells exploded. The nose of the huge airship stood up at a 45-degree angle, like that, as one hydrogen cell after another exploded, sending the flames steadily toward the front of the thing, as you can see on that poster. Then fire belched from the nose like a torch, and what was left of the Hindenburg crashed to earth. Some of the passengers jumped as the airship fell because it was closer to the ground. A surprising number of them simply ran out of the craft after all of the outer fabric had burned away and the steel frame was on the ground. So they could actually run away. And in all, 62 people survived. 13 passengers were killed and 23 crewmen died. The cause of the tragedy has never been proved, despite theories and investigations. The designer of the Hindenburg, the famous designer Hugo Echner, was convinced he knew the cause of the crash. Quote, "It was obviously tail heavy during the landing. There must have been a hydrogen leak in the tail area," he said. The ship made a fast, sharp turn during its landing approach. And the end of the wire, a broaching wire, gave way during this sharp maneuver. And the end of the wire must have whipped about and tore a large gash in one of the cells. Hydrogen began to escape. It rose and collected just under the cover near the upper tail fin. Finally, a spark generated by the electrified atmosphere created by the storms touched it off. From that point on, the worldwide public lost its confidence in the safety of dirigibles. And as winged airplanes grew in speed and length of performance, no more passenger dirigibles were built. In an age of jet planes and sophisticated electronics, the old-fashioned airship had passed out of existence. Only a few non-rigid blimps operate in the world today. They are used for public relations purposes like Goodyear. Like the giant dinosaur, the huge airship could not cope with a changing age and became extinct. Its size and slowness were responsible. But, the dirigibles had a romance about them. Truly giants in the sky, their silent, mysterious silver forms will be remembered as a tremendous phenomenon never to be encountered again in the world of aviation. Their brief, exciting age is over. Thank you. I'll try to answer any questions that come up.
Fascinating.
Oh,
You said after that they had very limited use, but has there ever been since the Hindenburg in any capacity with Goodyear anything that they've had one that has crashed?
I don't know. I don't know for sure. I don't know. I haven't. I'm not aware of any crashes. There weren't many flying after that. But
Before that, they had a lot of crashes.
Ah.
Hindenburg, but they had an excellent on American Experience years ago about them and Hindenburg and all that, and they showed a lot of these film clips.
yeah.
There's a lot of accidents that people
Oh,
don't realize.
I know it. The Akron, the Macon, a number of other big, powerful ships, but it was not to be, I guess. Yes.
Is there a museum anywhere for airships?
Good question.
I'm not aware of one. You'd think that the Goodyear might like to have one, but I don't know if it does. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd think there'd be one in the Smithsonian or something.
There's probably at least some kind of
You would think.
exhibit in the Smithsonian, the Air Museum. Yeah,
You would think.
I gotta go back there and look.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and then we'll be serving lunch.
Okay. Any others?
Yes.
Okay, I guess we're all set.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming.